January 3, 1945. Versailles, France. The conference room at Chef headquarters was thick with tension. Outside, a bitter winter wind whipped through the grounds of the palace where French kings had once ruled. Inside, the leaders of the Western Alliance were on the verge of tearing each other apart. Charles de Gaulle, leader of Free France, sat rigidly across from Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Winston Churchill had flown in from London despite the dangers of winter travel. The British Prime Minister understood that this meeting could determine the fate of the alliance itself. The subject of this emergency meeting was a single city, Strasbourg. Just 2 days earlier, over 100,000 German soldiers had smashed into American lines in Alsace. The offensive caught every commander off guard. Allied forces were still reeling from the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, and now Hitler had opened a second front. The stakes could not have been higher. Eisenhower had made a decision that threatened to tear the coalition apart. He had ordered General Jacob Devers to abandon Strasbourg, pulling the entire 6th Army Group behind the Vosges Mountains, effectively surrendering every inch of ground that American and French soldiers had bled to capture just 6 weeks earlier. De Gaulle was furious. His voice, sharp and cutting, echoed across the room as he demanded explanations. Allied officers exchanged nervous glances. The tension was almost tangible, a mix of anger, fear, and exhaustion. This was more than a strategic disagreement. It was a test of leadership under pressure. Decisions made in this room could alter the course of the war in Western Europe, and while tempers flared and alliances strained, one figure remained calm amidst the storm. General Jacob Devers, known for his foresight and meticulous planning, was quietly preparing for what would come next. A battle that would test not just soldiers, but the very judgment of Allied command. Before we move forward, hit subscribe for more untold World War II stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This story is about courage, strategy, and leadership under unimaginable pressure. In the weeks leading up to January 3, 1945, the Western Allies faced a precarious situation. The Battle of the Bulge had already stretched American forces to their limits. In the dense Ardennes forests, freezing temperatures and relentless German assaults had tested the endurance, discipline, and morale of Allied troops. Thousands of soldiers had fallen, and supply lines were tenuous at best. Commanders across the front were exhausted, and the specter of German counterattacks loomed large. While the Allies celebrated the eventual containment of the Ardennes offensive, few realized that Hitler had already plotted a second, equally ambitious strike farther south in Alsace. Strasbourg was a critical target. Its capture or loss would have far-reaching strategic implications, threatening the integrity of the Allied front and potentially opening the Rhine River corridor to German forces. Intelligence reports were streaming into Schaff headquarters, painting a picture of an enemy force vastly underestimated by most commanders. Over 100,000 seasoned German troops, well-equipped and motivated, were preparing to smash through the American 6th Army Group. The intelligence, though clear, was treated skeptically by some senior officers who still clung to the belief that the Wehrmacht was exhausted and incapable of mounting a coordinated assault. General Jacob Devers, however, was not convinced. Known for his methodical approach and foresight, he had spent weeks analyzing troop movements, supply line vulnerabilities, and terrain advantages. Devers understood that underestimating the enemy in winter conditions could be catastrophic. Unlike many commanders who relied on hope and conventional assumptions, he prepared for the worst. Winterized supplies were stockpiled, artillery positions reinforced, and fallback lines established behind the Vosges Mountains. Soldiers were briefed and trained for rapid repositioning, and communication networks were tested for resilience against potential disruptions. Despite his preparations, Devers faced resistance from higher command. Eisenhower's order to abandon Strasbourg was a pragmatic decision aimed at consolidating forces and avoiding a wider catastrophe. But it clashed with Devers' conviction that properly prepared troops could hold the city long enough to blunt the German offensive. The tension was palpable. De Gaulle's fury only added to the stakes, highlighting the delicate balance between political pressures and military strategy. The meeting in Versailles was more than a disagreement, it was a confrontation of philosophies. Some commanders prioritized, minimizing immediate casualties, while Devers argued for strategic positioning and foresight, emphasizing that short-term losses could be mitigated with planning and discipline. The human element weighed heavily on every decision. Soldiers who had endured the Ardennes now faced another punishing winter campaign, one where every decision by command could mean life or death. Officers at Versailles understood the burden of responsibility. Each strategy adopted or abandoned would ripple across the front, influencing morale, survival, and the pace of the Allied advance toward Germany. Before we move forward to see how the German offensive begins, take a moment to hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Eyes like this remind us that leadership, preparation, and courage often decide the fate of entire armies, not just individual battles. As winter winds howled outside the palace walls, Devers' mind was already moving ahead, visualizing the battlefield, predicting enemy maneuvers, and ensuring that, no matter the outcome of political disputes, his troops would be as ready as humanly possible. The stage was set. The Ardennes was behind them. Strasbourg lay ahead, and one general's foresight would soon be tested against the full fury of the German war machine. By early January 1945, the German army was quietly mobilizing for what would become the second offensive in the Ardennes region, this time aimed at Strasbourg in the Alsace sector. Hitler's strategy was audacious, designed to split the Allies, disrupt supply lines, and potentially force a political realignment in Western Europe. Reports trickled into Schaff headquarters, often delayed or fragmented, but General Jacob Devers had a keen eye for piecing together the puzzle. Unlike many commanders who dismissed the possibility of a second German assault, Devers saw the signs clearly: sudden troop movements, unusual supply stockpiles, and reconnaissance reports that hinted at a concentrated strike. Devers' foresight was not born of luck. He had spent years in command roles emphasizing preparation, adaptability, and the careful analysis of terrain. In his view, the Ardennes had been a harsh lesson. Allied forces could not afford to assume the enemy would act predictably. Every forest path, river crossing, and mountain pass was scrutinized. Maps littered his office, annotated with enemy positions, likely advance routes, and fallback zones. Artillery units were positioned to cover critical choke points. Engineers reinforced bridges and roads, and infantry units were given clear orders for rapid redeployment under fire. Yet intelligence was only part of the equation. Devers understood that leadership, morale, and communication were just as crucial. He held frequent briefings with his subordinate officers, walking them through potential scenarios, encouraging questions, and testing their understanding of contingencies. Unlike other commanders who relied on orders issued once and assumed compliance, Devers fostered initiative within the chain of command. Every company commander knew not only what to do but why it mattered in the larger strategy. Soldiers were drilled for mobility, trained for defensive engagements in harsh winter conditions, and prepared to hold positions longer than initially expected. Meanwhile, at Versailles, political and military tensions simmered. Eisenhower's order to pull back from Strasbourg created friction, particularly with Charles de Gaulle, who saw the city as a symbol of French liberation. Devers navigated this complex landscape carefully. He respected his superiors and understood the political ramifications of disobedience, but he remained steadfast in his belief that strategic preparation could blunt the German offensive. Before we continue to see the battle unfold, take a moment to subscribe for more untold World War II stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's incredible to see viewers from across the globe following these moments of history. As German forces began their push toward Strasbourg, Devers' foresight started to pay off. Troops were already positioned along critical terrain features, artillery covered expected advance routes, and communication lines remained intact despite the winter chaos. His meticulous planning meant that when German units hit the front, they encountered resistance far more organized than the enemy had anticipated. Devers' ability to anticipate movements, pre-position forces, and maintain morale under extreme stress was about to be tested on a scale that would define his leadership and the course of the battle. Every decision, every placement of troops, every defensive position mattered. The groundwork laid by Devers over weeks of preparation would determine whether Strasbourg could hold, how many lives would be saved, and how the Allies would respond to Hitler's second gamble in the Ardennes. The stage was set for one of the most decisive winter campaigns of World War II, and one general's vision would make the difference between disaster and survival. January 5, 1945. The German offensive in Alsace had begun in earnest. Across the snow-covered landscape, armored divisions rolled forward, supported by infantry and artillery, intent on smashing the American lines and seizing Strasbourg. For most Allied units, the advance was a shock. Communications were chaotic, reinforcements were delayed, and winter conditions made movement slow and dangerous. Yet in the sector commanded by General Jacob Devers, the story was very different. His preparations, made weeks in advance, turned what could have been disaster into a controlled defense. Devers' foresight became immediately apparent. artillery units had been placed on high ground overlooking likely advance routes, creating kill zones that would funnel German troops into areas where they could be engaged most effectively. Engineers had reinforced key bridges and roads, ensuring that tanks and supply convoys could move rapidly even under heavy fire or in deep snow. Infantry companies were already dug in, camouflaged, and prepared for immediate counterattacks. Unlike many other sectors, which were scrambling to react, Devers' forces moved with the quiet confidence of troops who had trained for exactly this scenario. As the German tanks approached, reconnaissance aircraft reported their positions back to Devers' common. D-posts. Officers relayed the information with precision, and orders were executed with minimal delay. Every artillery salvo and infantry maneuver had been rehearsed. Soldiers knew not only their positions, but also how to coordinate with neighboring units, ensuring that gaps in the defense were minimized. The general had emphasized redundancy in communications and command, anticipating that radios could fail or messengers could be delayed. This attention to detail gave his forces an almost preternatural awareness of the battlefield, allowing them to respond swiftly and decisively. Meanwhile, tensions at higher command continued to simmer. Eisenhower's order to pull back from Strasbourg was still fresh in everyone's minds, and political pressure from Charles de Gaulle added to the complexity. Devers maintained his calm, balancing the competing demands of strategy and diplomacy while focusing on the immediate task, holding the line. His staff officers marveled at his ability to anticipate enemy actions and issue orders that seemed to arrive just in time every time. Before we move to see how the German assault intensifies, take a moment to hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's amazing to see history being explored from all over the world. By mid-morning, the first waves of German infantry collided with Devers' prepared defenses. Snow and mud slowed the attackers, making them vulnerable to concentrated fire. Artillery and machine gun positions, perfectly sighted, inflicted heavy casualties while minimizing exposure to Devers' own troops. Counterattacks were launched at pre-planned intervals, striking flanks and cutting off advance units. The Germans quickly realized that this was no ordinary resistance. The Americans were organized, disciplined, and anticipating every move. Through the day, Devers' calm leadership ensured that reinforcements were efficiently integrated, supply lines remained intact, and morale stayed high despite the bitter cold and relentless enemy pressure. Soldiers on the front lines noticed the difference. Where other units faced chaos and uncertainty, Devers' troops had clear orders, strategic depth, and contingency plans at every level. By evening, it was clear that the German offensive had met a formidable obstacle. While other sectors faltered, Devers' foresight, planning, and meticulous preparation had allowed his forces not only to survive, but to inflict significant losses on the attackers. The stage was set for the battle to escalate further, but the advantage lay with those who had anticipated, prepared, and acted decisively. The Ardennes winter would be merciless, but in Devers' sector, order had turned chaos into controlled resistance. January 6, 1945. The German offensive in Alsace had intensified, and Strasbourg was now directly under threat. Across the snow-laden countryside, tanks churned through frozen fields, infantry units advanced cautiously under sporadic artillery fire, and the wind carried the echoes of battle through the Vosges mountains. Most Allied units were struggling to regroup, communication lines were stretched thin, and panic had begun to take hold in unprepared sectors. But in General Jacob Devers' command area, the scene was markedly different. His meticulous preparations were starting to show tangible results. Devers' prior weeks of planning meant that every inch of ground had been considered. Artillery batteries, positioned for maximum coverage, were raining shells on approaching German columns. Infantry units held defensive lines reinforced with trenches, obstacles, and hidden machine gun positions. Soldiers had been briefed extensively on winter warfare tactics, and every officer knew their responsibilities down to the smallest detail. The chaos reigned in other sectors. Devers' forces operated with coordination and precision, turning preparation into a formidable advantage. The general himself was constantly moving between command posts, evaluating reports, issuing orders, and adjusting strategies based on the enemy's movements. His calm demeanor reassured his officers, who in turn kept their troops focused. Devers had anticipated that German forces would attempt to exploit weak points along his lines, so contingency units were held in reserve, ready to counter any breakthrough. Engineers had strengthened bridges, cleared paths for artillery mobility, and ensured supply trucks could reach forward positions despite deep snow and icy terrain. Meanwhile, the human cost of the offensive was apparent everywhere. Soldiers were exhausted, freezing, and exposed to the harsh winter conditions. Yet Devers' planning mitigated some of these hardships. Rations were pre-positioned, medical teams were strategically deployed, and every unit had pre-arranged signals for emergencies. Troops could act decisively without waiting for delayed instructions, a critical difference in life-or-death situations. The general's foresight extended to morale as well. Small gestures like ensuring hot meals reached forward positions and rotation schedules for exhausted men reinforced resilience and cohesion. Before we continue to see the full impact of the German assault, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that preparation, leadership, and foresight often determine the fate of thousands. By mid-afternoon, German tanks and infantry were fully engaged with Devers' defensive lines. Their attempts to breach the front were met with disciplined resistance. Artillery fire, pre-calculated to cover every approach, inflicted heavy casualties and disrupted coordinated attacks. Infantry units executed counterattacks at key points, cutting off enemy flanks and reclaiming lost ground. It was a brutal, grinding engagement, but Devers' foresight meant that his forces could respond without hesitation. Reports from the front lines highlighted the difference his leadership made. In sectors outside Devers' command, units were overwhelmed, retreats were chaotic, and soldiers faced confusion and heavy losses. In contrast, his troops had clarity of purpose, coordinated firepower, and effective command and control. Devers' careful study of terrain, enemy tendencies, and logistics had transformed potential disaster into manageable resistance. As night fell over the Vosges Mountains, it was clear that the general's preparations had changed the course of the engagement. German forces, expecting an easy advance, had encountered a wall of discipline and strategy they had not anticipated. The battle for Strasbourg was far from over, but in Devers' sector, foresight, planning, and leadership had bought crucial time, preserved lives, and provided a foundation for the Allies to respond effectively to one of Hitler's boldest winter offensives, January 7, 1945. The battle for Strasbourg had reached a critical stage. German forces, frustrated by unexpected resistance, intensified their assault, deploying armored divisions, mechanized infantry, and artillery in a coordinated push. Snow and ice covered the roads, making movement treacherous for both sides. But in General Jacob Devers' sector, every challenge had been anticipated. Troops moved with precision, artillery units shifted positions seamlessly, and defensive lines held firm against repeated attacks. Devers' foresight in logistics and supply proved invaluable. Fuel and ammunition depots had been pre-stocked, and forward medical units ensured that wounded soldiers received immediate attention. This preparation allowed his units to sustain operations under conditions that had crippled neighboring sectors, where others struggled with disrupted supply lines. Devers' forces operated almost as if the battle had been rehearsed. His meticulous attention to detail extended beyond immediate combat concerns. Communications were redundantly established. Runners, radios, and signal flags ensured that orders reached the front lines without delay, even under heavy enemy fire. The general's leadership style also had a profound impact on morale. Unlike many commanders who relied solely on rank and orders, Devers led by example, moving through the front lines to assess conditions firsthand and motivate his troops. Soldiers noticed the difference. There was a sense of confidence and purpose even in the most intense moments of combat. Officers knew that every contingency had been considered, and enlisted men understood that their efforts were part of a larger, cohesive strategy. At the same time, the broader Allied command structure was under strain. Eisenhower's directive to pull back from Strasbourg remained controversial, and political pressure from Charles de Gaulle added tension to the strategic decision-making. Yet Devers remained focused on his objective: hold the line and ensure that the German offensive failed. His calm, calculated approach contrasted sharply with the panic and confusion in less prepared sectors. Before we move forward to see how the German assault begins to falter, take a moment to hit subscribe for more untold World War II stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Understanding the human and strategic elements of leadership in war gives a unique perspective on history. By mid-morning, German units attempted to breach the Vosges defensive lines. Tanks advanced through narrow passes, infantry pressed forward under artillery fire, and snipers harassed key positions. Yet Devers' anticipation of every likely route allowed his artillery and infantry to respond with precision. Pre-sighted artillery zones disrupted armored columns, and machine gun nests covered the approaches with deadly accuracy. Counterattacks launched from reserve units exploited weak points in the German formation, slowing the advance and forcing enemy forces into defensive postures of their own. As the day progressed, it became increasingly clear that preparation, not luck, was determining the battle's outcome. Devers' foresight in logistics, troop training, and battlefield awareness meant that his forces could absorb repeated assaults while minimizing losses and maintaining cohesion. Meanwhile, soldiers from other sectors who faced similar attacks without such preparation suffered heavy casualties and confusion. By evening, German forces had failed to achieve their objectives in Devers' sector. The general's careful planning, relentless focus on preparedness, and ability to anticipate enemy tactics had transformed a potentially catastrophic offensive into a manageable engagement. The battle was far from over, but Devers' troops had already gained a decisive edge, illustrating the profound impact that leadership, strategy, and foresight can have on the course of war. January 8, 1945. The German offensive in Alsace showed no signs of slowing, but in General Jacob Devers' sector, the tide of battle was beginning to shift. Reports from the front lines indicated that German troops were facing unexpectedly stiff resistance. Tanks bogged down in the snow, infantry units became disoriented in the forested terrain, and artillery fire from well-positioned American units disrupted the enemy's advance. Devers' prior preparations were paying off, demonstrating that foresight and planning could overcome even the harshest winter conditions and a determined enemy. Devers had anticipated every key variable. He knew the importance of terrain and had positioned his troops to exploit natural defensive advantages. Narrow passes, wooded hills, and frozen rivers created choke points that slowed the German advance and made it easier for American artillery and machine gun teams to inflict maximum casualties. Infantry units, trained for winter combat and familiar with the layout of their defensive lines, held their ground with discipline and precision. Where other Allied sectors were overwhelmed by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack, Devers' forces moved almost as if executing a rehearsed maneuver, each soldier and officer understanding not only their role but the purpose behind it. Communication was another crucial factor. Devers had redundantly established lines of contact across his sector. Runners, field telephones, radios, and signal flags ensured that orders reached the front lines promptly, even under heavy bombardment. This allowed counterattacks to be executed quickly and reinforcements to be directed to areas where they were most needed. The general's calm presence and clear instructions bolstered the confidence of his officers, who in turn maintained the morale of their soldiers. Outside the battlefield, political and strategic pressures continued to weigh on Devers. Eisenhower's decision to withdraw from Strasbourg remained contentious, and Charles de Gaulle's insistence on holding the city complicated discussions at higher command. Yet Devers' focus never wavered. He concentrated on what he could control, the positioning, readiness, and coordination of his troops, and trusted that careful preparation would yield results in the chaos of battle. Before we continue to the next phase of the battle, take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more untold World War II stories, and Dr. A comment telling us where you're watching from. It's incredible to see viewers from around the world following these moments of history. By late morning, German units attempted to breach critical points in the Vosges defensive line. Tanks advanced through narrow forested valleys, while infantry tried to flank positions. However, Devers' pre-positioned artillery rained fire down on advancing columns, cutting off supply and support. Machine gun nests and rifle squads held critical choke points, repelling repeated assaults. Reserves, strategically stationed behind the lines, were quickly deployed to reinforce weak spots, thwarting any breakthrough attempts. Through the day, the general's meticulous planning continued to bear fruit. Soldiers reported a sense of confidence and coordination that was rare on a battlefield under such extreme conditions. Casualties, while inevitable, were minimized, and units maintained cohesion despite the relentless enemy pressure. Devers' foresight had transformed a potentially disastrous German offensive into a manageable, controlled engagement, setting the stage for counterattacks that would further turn the tide. By evening, it was clear that Devers' strategy was working. His troops had withstood repeated attacks, inflicted significant losses on the enemy, and maintained critical defensive positions. The difference between prepared and unprepared units had never been clearer. Leadership, strategy, and meticulous planning had proven decisive, and the battle for Strasbourg had begun to favor those who had anticipated every challenge. January 9, 1945. The German offensive in Alsace had entered its third day, and the battle for Strasbourg was reaching a critical turning point. Across the snow-covered plains and forested hills, German troops continued to press their assault, but in General Jacob Devers' sector, the impact of his careful planning became increasingly evident. Where other Allied units were disorganized, suffering from lack of supplies and unclear orders, Devers' forces operated with precision, discipline, and a clear sense of purpose. Devers had anticipated nearly every contingency. Artillery units were positioned to cover all likely avenues of approach, creating deadly crossfires that cut down advancing tanks and infantry. Engineers had fortified roads, bridges, and natural choke points, ensuring that even in adverse conditions, troop movements and supply lines remained effective. Infantry units were drilled to hold positions and conduct counterattacks efficiently, often moving in coordinated waves to exploit enemy weaknesses. The general had trained his officers to think independently, allowing them to make quick decisions when communication lines were disrupted, a critical advantage in the chaos of battle. By morning, German forces had launched a concentrated push toward the Vosges mountains. Tanks advanced cautiously along narrow valleys, attempting to outflank defensive positions, while infantry tried to infiltrate through wooded terrain. Devers' artillery opened fire in pre-planned sequences, targeting enemy columns with deadly accuracy. Machine gun nests, camouflaged and strategically sited, cut down advancing infantry, while rifle squads held critical positions that prevented German forces from gaining momentum. The human element was equally important. Soldiers were exhausted, cold, and facing relentless enemy pressure, but morale remained high in Devers' sector. His constant presence at command posts, personal inspections at the front lines, and clear communication reassured troops that their leaders were capable and decisive. Every soldier knew the larger purpose of their actions, and this cohesion allowed units to hold firm even in the face of overwhelming odds, political and strategic pressures continued to weigh on the Allied command. Eisenhower's directive to abandon Strasbourg had created tension with Charles de Gaulle and other political figures. Yet Devers remained focused on the operational reality. The German advance could be contained, losses minimized, and the integrity of the line preserved. His calm, calculated approach contrasted sharply with the panic and uncertainty in sectors less prepared for the assault. Before we move on to see the turning point of the battle, take a moment to subscribe for more untold World War II stories and comment below where you're watching from. Leadership, strategy, and preparation often define outcomes that seem impossible at first glance. By afternoon, German forces had begun to falter in Devers' sector. Coordinated counterattacks, pre-positioned reserves, and well-timed artillery strikes disrupted enemy formations. Tanks were forced to retreat or become immobilized in snow-covered terrain, while infantry units suffered heavy casualties and disorganization. Devers' anticipation of these scenarios ensured that his troops could respond immediately, maintaining cohesion and exploiting every opportunity to push back the attackers. As night fell, it became clear that Devers' meticulous planning, foresight, and disciplined execution were turning the tide. The Germans had underestimated the level of preparation and leadership present in his sector. While the larger battle still raged and other sectors struggled, Devers' forces had inflicted significant losses, held critical positions, and demonstrated that careful preparation could make the difference between disaster and resilience. The battle for Strasbourg was far from over, but Devers' leadership had already set the stage for the Allies to regain the initiative. January 10, 1945. The battle for Strasbourg had reached a critical crescendo. German foe, RCEs, frustrated by repeated setbacks, attempted to consolidate their gains and mount a concentrated offensive in Devers' sector. Across the snow-covered hills and frozen valleys, tanks rumbled forward, infantry pressed through wooded areas, and artillery fire rained down intermittently. For most Allied sectors, this escalation caused panic and disarray, but in General Jacob Devers' command area, the situation was very different. Devers' foresight and meticulous preparation had created a defensive network that was difficult to penetrate. Artillery units, pre-sighted on every approach route, disrupted enemy advances before they could reach the front lines. Machine gun nests and infantry positions, carefully camouflaged and strategically placed, inflicted significant casualties while minimizing exposure to friendly forces. Reserves were deployed quickly to threaten sectors, reinforcing weak points and countering German maneuvers. Each movement had been anticipated. Every decision made in the heat of battle had a basis in prior planning. The general's leadership extended beyond strategy and logistics. He frequently visited forward, command posts, assessing conditions firsthand and providing guidance to officers under extreme stress. His presence reassured troops, strengthened morale, and ensured that units maintained cohesion even under intense pressure. Soldiers followed orders with confidence, knowing that every action fit into a larger coordinated plan. In contrast, neighboring sectors that lacked such preparation were experiencing confusion, retreat, and heavy losses. Political tensions continued to simmer at higher levels. Eisenhower's earlier order to pull back from Strasbourg remained controversial, and Charles de Gaulle continued to insist on holding the city for symbolic and strategic reasons. Devers, however, remained focused on the battlefield realities. His concern was the effective deployment of forces, the maintenance of defensive integrity, and the preservation of life. While political debates raged, he executed the strategies that would prove decisive. Before we continue to see how the battle reaches its turning point, hit subscribe for more untold World War II stories and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's fascinating to see viewers from all over the globe following these critical moments in history. By late morning, the Germans launched a full-scale push against Devers' lines. Tanks attempted to break through narrow passes, while infantry sought to infiltrate flanks and weak points. Pre-positioned artillery opened fire at precisely the right moments, halting advances and causing chaos in enemy ranks. Infantry units, using terrain to their advantage, repelled attacks and counterattacked at critical junctures. The coordination between artillery, infantry, and reserves demonstrated the effectiveness of Devers' careful planning and rehearsed contingency measures. Throughout the day, the difference between prepared and unprepared sectors became painfully clear. Where other units struggled to maintain order under enemy pressure, Devers' forces remained disciplined, cohesive, and responsive. Casualties were managed, supply lines remained functional, and command communications operated seamlessly despite the ongoing bombardment. Soldiers were able to act decisively, not reactively, because the general had anticipated their needs and the enemy's movements. As evening fell, the German offensive in Devers' sector had been effectively blunted. Troops had held critical positions, inflicted significant enemy casualties, and maintained the integrity of their defensive line. The careful preparation, foresight, and leadership of General Jacob Devers had turned what could have been a catastrophic assault into a controlled, manageable engagement. While the larger battle for Strasbourg continued, it was clear that Devers' sector had become a bastion of resistance, a testament to the power of strategy, planning, and unwavering leadership under extreme conditions. January 11, 1945. The battle for Strasbourg was finally winding down. German forces, exhausted by repeated failed assaults and heavy casualties, began to retreat, leaving behind a battlefield marked by snow, mud, and the remnants of armored columns. In Devers' sector, the careful planning, foresight, and leadership of one general had turned what could have been disaster into a story of resilience and strategy prevailing against overwhelming odds. General Jacob Devers' meticulous preparations had saved countless lives. Soldiers under his command had endured the harsh winter, relentless enemy pressure, and the chaos of battle with cohesion and purpose. Artillery units had delivered precise, devastating fire, infantry had held critical lines, and reserves had been deployed at exactly the right moment. Every decision, every pre-positioned supply cache, and every contingency plan had been validated in the crucible of combat. The contrast with other sectors was stark. Where unprepared units had faltered, lost ground, or suffered catastrophic casualties, Devers' foresight had allowed the Allies to hold Strasbourg, protect supply lines, and maintain strategic advantage. This was a testament to leadership, discipline, and the ability to anticipate an enemy's moves before they occurred. Before we close this story, take a moment to subscribe for more untold World War II stories and comment where you're watching from. It's incredible to see history being explored from every corner of the world. The battle for Strasbourg highlighted a timeless lesson in warfare. Preparation and leadership can turn the tide even in the most desperate situations. General Devers' actions not only blunted Hitler's second offensive in Alsace, but also set an example of how foresight, strategy, and courage could shape the course of war. His legacy in the winter campaign of 1945 remains a defining moment in Allied history, a reminder that even in chaos, order, discipline, and planning can prevail.